Hi, this is Ann Hill with Dream Talk Radio, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Evan Thompson. Evan is a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Canada, Vancouver, and he is the author most recently of Waking, Dreaming, Being, Self and Consciousness in Neuroscience, Meditation, and Philosophy. Evan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me to join you.
I've been meaning to talk with you for a long time because I've seen your stuff. I can't remember now. Maybe it was a review of the book when it came out, and I just thought, or maybe I think you had an article about dreams in some major periodical in the last couple years, and I thought, wow, this is somebody I really want to interview about dreams. And so maybe you could just start by saying I know you have a long history with meditation and philosophy, but where in particular did your interest in dreams come from?
Oh, well, I've actually had an interest in dreams since I was a really little kid. Some of my earliest memories as a child are of dreams that I had, and I would always tell my parents my dreams and talk to them about them, and that was very much encouraged in our family. So I've always been a pretty vivid dreamer. So I would say, from the very beginning, just the nature of dreams, what happens in dreams, how dreams are related to waking life. That's just something that's really kind of gripped me. And in many ways that actually, I suppose, is a kind of motivation that led me into my interest in philosophy.
Mm. You recount several dreams of your own, but the one that really grabbed me today as I was looking through the book again was probably one of the earliest dream reports I've ever heard, when you were 2 and your parents tell the story, you were 2, and what's the maybe you should tell us.
So I don't actually remember this, but both my dad and my mom tell me that when I was about 2 years old, we were living in Dublin at the time. My dad was writing his dissertation there, and that he was reading, I think it was maybe Newsweek or Time magazine, and there was a picture of one of the new Marc Chagall stained glass windows, maybe the one that's in the church or cathedral in Zurich. And they say that I looked at it and kind of pointed to it and said, "That's Evan sleeping." And they didn't quite know what to make of that. And since I don't remember it, I don't really exactly know what to make of it. But what they, assumed it meant was that's kind of how things, that was my memory of how things looked when I would be asleep or when I was falling asleep or something like that. So.
Yeah, that's just such a beautiful depiction. I mean, I think just based on my own experience raising kids and just memories, very early memories, I remember colors. Colors and sounds much more than imagery per se, which
yeah, definitely. I do remember as a pretty little kid. So this is a personal memory of at night falling asleep, or especially in naps in the afternoon. This kind of hypnagogic state where you hear sounds and see things in the room that aren't there, or as you're falling asleep, all these kind of colors play in various ways, and that's a very early memory for me.
So the other thing that I noted is I was reading an interview of you by someone else, and you mentioned that in this book, which is really beautifully written, I have to say. I mean, for a subject matter that is dense and one would assume impenetrable to the general reader, I found your way of writing it, just based in anecdote and example, very easy to step into. And I could step on and off the bus of Indian philosophy quite easily in this book, whereas usually I'm just sort of out by paragraph 2 and I've been reading the same line for a half an hour. So kudos to that. Anyway.
Yeah, that's very nice to hear. Thank you very much for saying that.
Well, yeah, and I'm serious. I mean, this is a difficult subject to broach. And one of the things that you mentioned in this other interview is that you wrote the chapters on dreaming first. It was hard to kind of get into the voice of the book. And so I was curious, why were those chapters on dreaming easy? Why was that the way in for you?
Well, I knew when I was working on the book that I wanted it to have a mixture of personal story and ideas, or that I wanted to actually be able to relate the ideas in a way that would come out of a personal narrative. And I found that that was actually easiest to do in writing about my dreams and using them to illustrate ideas about dreaming. And the whole book actually really kind of got started for me. And this is something that I mentioned in the book, when I went to India for the very first time I had ever been to India. And I went for a meeting with the Dalai Lama, sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute. And so this was a meeting between scientists and the Dalai Lama and other Tibetan monks and scholars. And the first night that I arrived in Dharamsala, I had a very, very vivid lucid dream. And it was actually, I had had kind of quasi-lucid dreams before that, but this was really the first kind of full-blown, very intense lucid dream. And I woke up, 4 or 5 in the morning, and I just wrote the dream down. And in the writing of that, and then kind of just keeping a journal of my time there in India, the book kind of took off from that. So that was actually the first thing that really got the book going, was that particular dream.
Oh, well, as it is in many instances, really, it's the dreams themselves that sort of suggest the pathway into the material.
Yeah.
So let's talk about maybe the main premise of the book, which seems to me that something to do with just looking at the question of is consciousness and connected or dependent on the brain, and this idea of self as not an object or a static identity, but as a process. Did I get that right? Would you?
Yeah. Yeah. So the I guess the overarching idea of the book is that our sense of self is not something fixed, that it's something that shifts across being awake and falling asleep and dreaming and lucid dreaming and out-of-body experiences, the various kinds of things that I cover in the chapters of the book, and that how that is put together is a matter of our awareness and what we are aware of and how we identify with some things we're aware of, like our body in our waking state, as being the self. And so I approach that through personal experience and through philosophical ideas, especially coming from Indian philosophy, and then also through neuroscience and the perspective that neuroscience gives us on looking at what is happening in the brain in order to create this self-experience that we have.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things we've been talking about lucid dreaming a little bit, there's one quote that I loved, which is that something about letting go of lucidity to release ourselves to the full presence of the dream. I love that. And maybe it's just because I'm not like a rapacious lucid dreamer, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, that actually came from a conversation that I had with Alan Wallace, who is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher and scholar, and he led a meditation retreat on the Tibetan Buddhist practices of dream yoga. And this was a retreat at the Upaya Zen Center and Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I had known Alan and participated with him actually in that meeting in India where I had my first very vivid lucid dream and the book came from. And then following up on that, I went to his lucid dream or dream yoga retreat, which was a 3 or 4 day retreat. And at one point in the course of his, there was alternating kind of meditation practice and talks and instructions for what to do when you went to sleep. And at one point in the talk, he said that from his perspective, or from his Buddhist perspective, that it's always better to be lucid in a dream than not to be lucid, because lucidity is a kind of mindfulness, and Buddhism, or the Buddhist way of life, is about cultivating mindfulness. And there was something about that didn't quite sit well with me. And so I asked him a question. I said, well, maybe dreams have their own value as sort of spontaneous, imaginative creations of the mind, and some of them can be lucid and some of them not, and that there's value to be had in the non-lucid ones. And he certainly admitted that there was value to be had in the non-lucid ones, but nonetheless, he kind of stuck to his view that in some sense the lucid state is a better state than the non-lucid one. And so I kind of, when I went back and was working on the book, really turned that around in my mind. And so there's a section in the book where I basically argue against that. I basically say that from my perspective, that's a kind of way of valuing something in our experience that implies devaluing something else. And in order to point out the value of just the immersion in the dream without necessarily lucidity, I actually draw from the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, who is a Taoist philosopher, early Chinese thought, who has this wonderful parable of the man who doesn't know whether he's dreaming he's a butterfly or wakes up and whether he's now a butterfly dreaming that he's a man or a person. And the way I read that parable, it's that there isn't actually a bridge of lucidity between the two. It's that in order to be fully present in the experience of being a butterfly or being a man, that it's actually, in some sense, important that there isn't that kind of higher monitoring, watching of the state. And so I see that as an important way to think about lucid dreaming in relationship to non-lucid dreaming, that there's a whole range of possibilities from very intense lucidity to moments of lucidity, and then moments in which the dream is not a lucid dream, and that valuing our dream life doesn't have to mean trying to always, have an awareness of the dream as a dream.
I was really glad to read that part of the book, because I do feel as though, even though we've gotten away from the sort of 1970s thing about lucidity being, have power over your dreams, I do feel as though there is some sort of a competitive, sort of a spiritual materialism that seeps in when you start talking about lucidity as though it's like the best drug of the century. It seems.
Yeah.
So I like how you managed to ameliorate that somewhat.
Yeah, I think it can very easily be something that gets fetishized as this special thing, the lucid dream, and then as you know, there's this whole literature and online culture about lucid dreaming, and some of that's very valuable, but some of it goes a little bit too far into this kind of fetishized view, in my opinion.
And I also liked how you described lucid dreaming, which is not being able to control aspects of the dream or to control the scenery of a dream, but being able to direct your attention to the dream itself. And I thought that, that seemed like a very Buddhist, a very philosophical take on it, but it way more accurate in my experience than just going, this is a candy shop, what can I summon next, kind of a thing.
Yeah, so that is definitely something I was getting from the kinds of Tibetan Buddhist dream yoga practices that Alan Wallace was teaching, is that lucidity is very much about a certain way that you can direct your attention to the dreamlike quality of the state. And in a way, that's a kind of control from a kind of cognitive science perspective, because attention is a so-called cognitive control process. So you could talk about that as a kind of control, but it's different from trying to intervene in the dream and trying to manipulate it, which is fine. There's that way of relating to the dream as well. But the simple ability to shift your attention to the dream-like quality of the state, that for me is the mark of lucidity.
And as you said, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be a long rhapsody. It can sort of occur in fits and starts. And early on in the book, you actually talk about the neuroscience, the findings that what we call the stream of awareness is actually more, it just kind of goes in spurts. So one of the things, people watching this video might want to explore your book in greater depth, especially if they're looking for something that matches science and philosophy quite well. I thought your grasp of the latest findings in cognitive science and neurophysiology is pretty pretty good. And also, you have way more experience in Eastern philosophy than most people. So I really valued your approach from that perspective. Um, Getting back to this idea of the self as process, one of the interesting things that you brought in was this sort of this taxonomy of modes of consciousness from Indian philosophy. And there's a type of I'm not going to go so far as to say map, but there you do have sort of an overlay um, of that with the different states of dreaming. There's hypnagogia, dreaming, dreamless sleep. Can you just sort of give us a nutshell version of that taxon, how you see those two modes interacting?
Yeah, so the organizing map for the book comes from ancient Indian philosophy, where very early on in the early texts of the Upanishads, there is a differentiation made between the waking state, the dreaming state, and the state of dreamless sleep, and then eventually a fourth state of pure awareness is added into the taxonomy. And so I use that as kind of the organizing principle for the book, and I have chapters on all of those states. Pure awareness is for me a kind of placeholder for meditative states of awareness, and so I talk about different kinds of meditative states of awareness in waking meditation, but also in, say, in lucid dreaming, in the practice of mindful awareness and lucid dreaming. But under the heading of dreaming, I differentiate between the hypnagogic state, or the state leading into sleep, in which the experience is one of images that play across visual awareness, that are you're not really there's a kind of spectator quality to the images. You watch them, but you also they're very suggestible. So depending on how you think or how you shift your attention, you can move and transform the images. But there's also a way in which they're always kind of a little bit ahead and out of control. And so that state has that particular quality to it. And then dreaming, in which there's a feeling of immersion in the dream world, and that marks it as different from the hypnagogic state. The hypnagogic state has this kind of watching spectator quality, and then in the dream state, you're immersed in the dream world, and you have a dream body often, either a partial body or a full body. It might not be your waking body, could be a different kind of body, or you sometimes see yourself from the outside in the dream. So you see a person or a character in the dream that you identify as yourself, but you're at a, say, elevated perspective watching that character in the dream. But there's still this feeling of immersion in the dream world. And that, for me, is the mark, that feature of immersion is the mark of the dream state, as distinct from the hypnagogic. And then lucid dreaming is when there's this ability, as we were saying before, to direct your attention to the dreamlike quality of the state. And sometimes that happens in a kind of implicit way, where you're not really explicitly thinking, this is a dream, I am dreaming. And then sometimes it really becomes full blown, in that sense that you actually think about the state as a dream. Right. And maybe you try to intervene in it and alter it, or maybe not. So lucidity admits of these differences. And then I talk about the state of dreamless sleep, where there are no images or thoughts. And in that sense, the sleep state is a deeper one. And then there's an interesting question in Indian philosophy about whether consciousness or a subtle awareness remains present in that state, or whether it's absent. And that bears on neuroscience discussions today, with the attempt to understand the way that the brain shifts across different conscious states, and what happens to consciousness in dreamless sleep. So I have a chapter devoted to that as well.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty fascinating. You do have one anecdote at the beginning of that chapter on dreamless sleep about getting woken out of a sound sleep by the telephone, and answering as though you were asleep, but you're not awake. I mean, answering as though you were awake, but you're really not. And so you get into the whole question of who had just answered the phone? Exactly. How did I rise from that?
Right? Well, that's an interesting moment, because it indicates that what we call the self, or our sense of self, has very different aspects to it. Because one sense of self is, you know who you are, you know your personal history, you have plans for the future, what, psychologists call an autobiographical sense of self. And then another sense of self is just the kind of bare feeling of being sentient, of being alive, of being embodied. And so in that moment of waking up from a deep sleep in a unexpected way, so I had traveled across the Atlantic, and so my sleep rhythms were altered, and I was jet lagging, and I was deeply asleep and was woken up by the telephone call. There's this immediate feeling of selfhood that has to do with being embodied, being alive, and even the almost sort of automatic routines of picking up the phone and saying hello. But the sense of who I am, where I am, what my history is, why am I here, where am I going, that's absent and has to kind of get reconstructed by eventually waking up and piecing it together. And so it really speaks to these different aspects of our experience of self.
Yeah, I mean, that I think that vignette really came closest for me in being able to understand what is meant, I guess, by that luminosity, just that awareness that sort of is behind or infused in whatever state of consciousness we're in. Because, I have had that experience of just like, who just answered that phone?
Right.
And apparently that was a cogent sentence, glory be, who knew? So, so let's talk some about the other chapters on sort of sleep-related states. You seem to have been a kid who's had a lot of experience and out-of-body experiences of various things, because I love how you sort of wove that stuff in. Explain a little bit about where how you think, out-of-body experiences relate to these sort of modes of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I had a number of pretty vivid, strong out-of-body experiences when I was a kid, and they were, again, things that I went and talked to my parents about, especially my father. And my father was a serious yoga practitioner and definitely had a view about out-of-body experiences, and he kind of gave me the in a way traditional yoga perspective that our consciousness is not limited to the physical body, that there are other more subtle energetic bodies that have their own life, you could say, and can journey apart from the physical body. So that was kind of the perspective that I had to make sense of the out-of-body experiences that I had. So for example, one out-of-body experience I had, the first one I had is I woke up in some sense, or at some point in the night became aware of myself lying in the bed below, and I was up by the ceiling, and I could see myself in the bed below, and I could see the ceiling, and I was up by the ceiling, and it was very vivid and didn't seem like a dream. It had a very strong kind of reality quality to it. And that was then when I woke up, I said to my mother, I had this strange dream, and she said, "No, maybe you should go talk to your dad about that." And then I, talked to my dad, so he kind of gave me this yoga framework for it, which was very valuable because it enabled me to make sense of the experience, to give it
Right.
meaning. But over the years, as I learned more about out-of-body experiences, from a neuroscience perspective, that these experiences happen under different conditions, and they can be related in certain ways to changes in brain activity patterns. Then I started to become skeptical about whether it was really right to think of them as a situation in which there was this other sort of non-physical or subtle physical energetic body that somehow separates from the physical body, journeys and does its own thing. And so I kind of recount that story in the out-of-body experience chapter of how I started having these experiences and the framework I had for understanding them, and then how I went through an exploration of reading the neuroscience literature on these experiences in a way that made me come out basically thinking, well, these experiences don't really show that there's a consciousness that can exist separately from the brain. Of course, your body and brain are still there working as you're asleep in the bed, or in other circumstances when you may have out-of-body experiences. So I tell that story in that chapter. And the interesting thing about out-of-body experiences, say one more thing about that, is that, going back to what I was just saying about the self before, the autobiographical sense of self, is that the structure of an out-of-body experience where you see yourself from the outside That's the same structure that can happen in memory. When you remember something, someone asks you, well, what did you wear to the party yesterday? And you have this immediate kind of mental image of yourself that you see yourself from the outside. Oh, I was wearing, that blue shirt. And it's as if you're looking down on yourself in the memory. And we know from the study of memory that memories, the original experience is, of course, from a first-person perspective, but memories transform into this third-person perspective, and that's an important thing about how memory functions. So that's the same structure as an out-of-body experience, or when you imagine yourself in the future, you sort of, oh, I have to give a talk, and I'm going to be nervous, and you imagine yourself on the stage, and see yourself from the outside, oh, the talk's going well. So again, that's kind of like an out-of-body experience. So it speaks to this way that we can have an outside perspective on ourselves, and that's a very deep and important feature about how the human mind works.
Right. Those are really useful allegories, and it reminds me of how you sort of how you speculate that the Tibetan Buddhist practice or stories around what happens when we die may have been developed by extrapolating from the dream experience. Or maybe you can say a little bit about
that. I think the Tibetan Buddhists have a very rich, you could say, metaphysics and phenomenology of sleep and dreaming. And their view is that what happens to you when you die is that you undergo a kind of dissolution or breakdown of the cognitive consciousness process that's very similar to what happens when you fall asleep. And this is why lucid dreaming is actually important for them, or the practice of dream yoga, that if you can train yourself to be more aware of how you fall asleep, you can, in the moment of dying and death, rely, as it were, on that awareness so as not to kind of get sucked into or to identify with how your mind is falling apart, to be able to witness it with a kind of equanimity. And at one point in the book, I say that one way to read that phenomenology of dying is as a kind of extrapolation from the phenomenology of falling asleep. Because, of course, when someone dies, they don't come back and tell us what the dying process is like. That's not possible. Yeah. And so anything that we might say about what happens when someone dies has got to be either based on how we interact with and care for people who are dying. So hospice workers have a lot of knowledge that's not, technical biomedical knowledge, but it's experiential, very valuable experiential knowledge. And also from what happens to the mind as it falls asleep, or in certain profound meditative states where that larger sense of awareness can be present without an identification with whatever thought happens to arise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and given the way that allegory and metaphor are so useful in comparing, for instance, sleep states to states of memory, that seems like a reasonable assumption. Yeah. One thing that I didn't see too much of in your book is talk about nightmares. What's your personal take on nightmares? Why we have them? What they're good for? All that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's, I think, one nightmare I relate in the book, which is also a very early childhood memory of one of my first dreams that I remember.
Which is a great dream, yeah.
Yeah, it starts out as not as a nightmare, and then turns into a nightmare where I'm in the backyard of our house, and my mother is outside and she's dancing around, and then the moon descends from the sky. I see the moon in the sky, it descends, and I touch it, and it turns into this monster, this kind of like robot-like monster. And that was absolutely terrifying as a kid. I just woke up and I was like, I remember, that's why I remember it now, is it was so vivid and so terrifying. So the question about nightmares is an interesting one. Scientists have different theories about nightmares. One very popular theory right now is that in dreams you need to kind of simulate various kinds of experiences that might occur in waking life that are that involve threat to you, so that you kind of mentally rehearse and can deal with threat. I think that there's some value in that perspective. Some scientists try to generalize that for understanding all of dreaming, and I'm skeptical of that. I also think that that in general in dreams, emotions are very intense. And so if for whatever reason the dream is going to have negative affect, it's going to be much more intense generally in a dream than it would be in waking life. And I suppose in my own waking experience, not so much when I was a kid, I wouldn't probably have been able to put this together, but in my own waking life, I definitely notice that if I'm anxious or feel stressed, that will come up in my dream life, and that there are basic, we all have them. We have basic kind of personal deep fears that can manifest very immediately and strongly in dreams, and those often are what make up the nightmare, and that's definitely part of the dynamics of the psyche.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things that came instantly to mind when I read that nightmare, that early nightmare of yours, was that, wow, it's the intuitive becoming scientific, and the fear about that. It just seemed like a dream presaging the fascination with how the moon works. How does
Yeah,
the
that's
mind
interesting.
work?
I like that. I never actually made that connection myself. I never thought of that, but it's true. I mean, as a kid, I was totally fascinated by scientific things, and then obviously I've gone on to work with neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. So that's actually, I never made that connection. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad. Right. Yeah, take it, use it.
Yeah, no, that's good. I like that.
I once had a conversation with Houston Smith. It was probably 12 years ago or so, where he was giving a talk about the Indian philosophy and the states of consciousness. And we got into a conversation afterwards about nightmares. And I can't remember how we got started, but we basically kind of came to, again, an allegory with Buddhism, an allegory that somehow, how, the Buddha, when he was sort of sat under the Bodhi tree and was going towards enlightenment, there's all these little demons. First the little demons, and the big demons came to sort of knock him out of the meditation, and he had to remember that it was a dream. And we just kind of thought, well, maybe that's, on some, obviously there's a ton of levels you can look at nightmare images, but maybe that's sort of the more philosophical one, to remember in the grip of the most horrifying nightmare that it's all a dream, and somehow it kind of ties back into that Buddhist practice.
Yeah, well, certainly in the Tibetan practices of dream yoga, one of the things that is mentioned is that if you can develop lucidity, that then when a nightmare happens, you can relate to it in a very different way. And in fact, there's Western psychological and therapeutic work using lucid dreaming to try to deal with people who have really serious nightmares, so that if you can become aware of the dream, you can either be equanimous in the face of something threatening or negative, or you can work to transform negative emotions like anger into positive emotions like compassion or loving kindness. And that's very much important in the Tibetan Buddhist practice, precisely because some emotions are so intense in dreams that if you can do that in the dream, it can carry over into how you deal with emotions in waking life.
Yes, absolutely. So again, the book weaves together really well. It's neuroscience and all of this, the kind of the edges of scientific exploration of consciousness, and also a very clear, lucid, if I may, explication of Indian philosophy and how those mesh. And I was really taken by your reasoning about why it almost became a sort of a political stance of being so open-minded, because, as you say, there's these two extreme regressive tendencies in society. Religious extremism on one hand, and this entrenchment of scientific materialism. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you see that those two forces shaping up?
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to do with the book was to show concretely and intellectually that the contemplative traditions of the world and religion has been the home for contemplative practice, can work with science in a collaborative way on a common project, which is understanding the mind and giving meaning to human life. And that's a third way or another option between, on the one hand, the religious extremism that rejects science, that becomes dogmatic, that's very prevalent in our time right now, and then the kind of anti-religious scientific materialism that seems to me to go to the other extreme and not to understand the need for meaning, for our lives to be made meaningful in the way that religion has always been concerned with, and that science actually doesn't provide that. Science, when it's related to other things in culture, like art and like religion and spirituality and philosophy, can participate in providing that, but science of its own doesn't actually provide that. And people who speak in this very strident scientific materialist way seem to think that, well, the scientific worldview is, that's just enough, and then their procedures are very, kind of combative and aggressive. So I wanted to show that there was something else that could be rigorously scientific and could be very open and skeptical, but could also really draw from the world's contemplative traditions and draw from them in a way that would really actually be beneficial to science as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's somewhat ironic, or maybe just worth noting, that two of the leading religious figures in the world are embracing this kind of seeming paradox. I mean, you write very movingly about the Dalai Lama and how he sort of was thinking, well, maybe, is mind, is consciousness, is there a part that is dependent on biology? So that's sort of really kind of opening that whole question. And now, honestly, Pope Francis, with his, bringing climate change into the world, into the more religious realm. So it's a notable time period. Do you see any other positive movement in that front to sort of find some movement through these two entrenched extremes?
Well, I think the entrenched extremes are very visible. They're visible politically, of course, and they're visible intellectually in the case of the scientific one. But I think for many people that I talk to who work in the brain sciences, who work in medicine, who work in psychology, that's not enough for them, and they already intuitively or very explicitly have this sense that there's another way that that things can go. So I see that as actually a widespread sentiment, if not always as visible, certainly very much present.
Well, that's good to know. And finally, I'm really curious about what's grabbing your attention now. What from either neuroscience or maybe some more phenomenological approach has really captured your imagination?
Well, one thing that I'm starting to think about writing. I haven't actually embarked on the writing yet, but it's definitely, I think, one of the next big writing projects actually comes out of Waking Dreaming Being, and it comes out of the chapter on dying and death.
Yeah.
What I really feel is that there's a need for a much more extensive discussion of the things that are treated in that chapter, particularly around how we as a culture need to really have a much more meaningful relationship to dying and death than we do. And this is happening through things like hospice, and a number of books in the past 4 or 5 years about death and dying have appeared, some by physicians, some personal stories of people caring for their parents. And I think it's an area where, again, the contemplative traditions really have something very valuable to offer, and that philosophy has something very valuable to offer, because philosophy, especially in the ancient world, in Greece and in India, was really about how to lead a good and meaningful life in a way that involves an understanding of the inevitability of death and the preparation of the mind for death. So I want to write something that, again, weaves those threads together, that's really devoted entirely to that subject matter.
Well, I was reading that chapter just a few days ago before visiting my mother, who is currently dying of Alzheimer's, which is
Oh,
a whole crazy thing about consciousness and self.
yeah.
What parts of the self exist and what parts of the brain are goo and all that stuff. But it was really helpful how you framed just talking about being with the process of dying in a, I don't know, you said it in a way that kind of gave me a little bit more strength than I feel like I have been exhibiting thus far, of just, wow, if I can really sit with this, that's, a gold star on my little star chart, right? It's really tough to be with the dying process, even if it's, even if it's easy or natural, long drawn out, or what we would consider not right, unjust death is so difficult.
Yeah, no, that's very difficult. I'm glad to hear that chapter has been, helpful or
Mm.
meaningful. I found that the writing of that chapter really, that was the most difficult chapter for me to write.
Oh,
Um, it took the longest time to write, and it kind of came together for me when I went and did the retreat that I describe in the chapter, the Being
yeah.
with Dying program at the Upaya Zen Center, and met just an incredible array of people working in palliative care and social workers and hospice workers, who came to this program that provides contemplative tools or methods or approaches for dealing with dying in oneself and also the care of others. And meeting those people and then going through the program really, uh, that was what I really wound up drawing on in the writing of that chapter. And then I really had difficulty with that chapter until
Mhm.
until that point, that retreat.
Yeah, well, it's beautifully, and including the meditation, Joan Halifax's meditation was really lovely. It enables the reader to kind of get a grasp on sort of the elemental nature of the process of dying. So
Yeah.
everybody's journey is slightly different, but that was a nice way of sharing in a secular way that practice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that a practice that you tend to do regularly, or was that more of a,
No,
okay, done that now?
no, I've done it a couple times, um, always led by somebody else.
Yeah.
It's based on a practice. It's a kind of secularized, I suppose you could say, way of carrying out a practice that traditionally would be done in a ritual way by the individual meditator.
Hmm.
And I haven't tried to practice it in that way because it seems to me that type of practice is very much, embedded within the traditional Tibetan Buddhist context.
Right, right.
And this is something that Joan Halifax has adapted for this particular program that she offers. So
Mm-hmm.
I've done it in that context, but it's not really something that I would practice on my own in that way. Yeah.
Okay.
But you can, I think, download a podcast of her leading the practice. So anyone who wants to kind of get a taste of it can do that.
Wow, what a great resource. I will look that up. One more question that I wanted to ask you about dying, and actually beyond what happens after dying mostly, is reincarnation. I still
Mm.
don't kind of get it, or maybe I've heard just so many versions of what the philosophy of reincarnation is that I don't really understand what it is. Is it like it's not the whole self that goes up, but it's I don't know. Can you like shed a little bit of light on that?
Well, so it depends who you ask, in the sense that within the Indian context, the Buddhists have one way of thinking about it, and the Hindus have a different way. In the Buddhist context, the idea, in I suppose the simplest terms, is just that consciousness or the mind has its own status and dynamics that's not exhausted by what the brain is doing. So when the brain shuts down, there's still an aspect of consciousness or awareness that continues to be present. And what impels it is, you could say, desire and a certain craving to be embodied, and that's what brings about a new birth. So it's not, in their view, as if there's an essential self that would be present in one life and then would be present in the next life. It's rather more like a river or a stream, where there's just a kind of flow of consciousness that continues after the death of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And I do talk about this in the book, the view of rebirth, and whether from a scientific perspective, at least our present scientific perspective, whether, how we should look upon this idea. And, the view that I suppose the perspective that I arrive at is basically that, well, in some sense we have to keep an open mind, because, it's not as if we know definitively one way or the other, but that nonetheless, the evidence that one would want to have certainty, or even, if not certainty, some confidence that that's actually the way things are, that from a scientific perspective, that evidence isn't there. Though some people like to point to studies and research that they think supports it. I don't find that particularly convincing.
Mm-hmm.
So I am skeptical,
Right.
and agnostic, I suppose, about that.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a point in the dying chapter, the chapter on dying and death, where I briefly talk about that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think for myself anyway, it becomes a useful way of, it's kind of like a placeholder, like something happens. I certainly don't believe that you just get, stuck in a hole in the ground or burnt to ash and that's that. Like there's something that, so it's kind of nice to just even have really a sort of a vague, only marginally educated view of what it actually means. To think that, consciousness, there, if we believe in some sort of, like, you have that wonderful dream of the guy who has his dream goes into darkness, but there's this warmth and intelligence. I think if we have that view of a benevolent intelligence in the universe somehow, that becomes kind of a proxy for imagining that spirit or awareness moves on, because there is sort of a larger bed of awareness supporting our existence.
Yeah, I think we're very used to, a worldview in which we divide, consciousness and the cosmos or physical nature. And from a perspective that sees things as not divided in that way, I think it becomes more possible to think of death as a kind of transformation in a process,
Right.
and not as a kind of annihilation in the particular modernist sense that it's often characterized. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that perspective, where it's just an annihilation, is a perspective that makes it very difficult for us to relate in a positive way to the fact that we are all going to die. At the same time, the kind of traditional, well, there's a spirit that carries on. That's also, for many people, including myself, not really credible in a way that it once was. So we're in a situation where we're struggling to make a different kind of meaning out of that.
Right. Well, I really look forward to reading whatever you have to say about the death and dying. That's going to be a great book. I'm looking forward to that already. Evan Thompson, author most recently of Waking, Dreaming, Being. You can pick up this book wherever awesome books are sold. Thank you so much for talking today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Take care.